The series of works I will be discussing were a collaborative project between two female Irish artists, Sarah Browne and Jessie Jones, titled In the Shadow of the State. In these works, they look at the female body through the perspective of the state and legal systems in modern times and historically since the 1800s. They also explore the home and domestic space within a feminist context. It was funded transnationally by Archangel in the UK and Create, the National Development Agency for Collaborative Arts in Ireland, and Dublin City Council. It was one of 9 projects funded by Art 2016, the Arts Council programme to celebrate the centenary of the Easter Rising in the Republic of Ireland. They also received additional support from Heart of Glass, St Helens and the Liverpool Biennial. As artists, Jessie and Sarah were not informed of the total financial and in-kind contribution from Archangel and other funders. The works were presented to the public in 2016, a time of cultural change for Ireland as Memento began building around the Repeal the Eighth movement. It was the first time in my memory as a young woman who grew up in Ireland that people so openly discussed women's rights, bodily autonomy, and the state's constant failure to look after and protect its women. It felt exciting and inspired an intense dialogue about women's rights and issues. There was a sense of urgency. We needed to change things now. The oppression of women had gone on too long. Decades of campaigning by organizations such as the Abortion Rights Campaign, Amnesty International, and Rosa had led to this very moment, and now was our chance to see real change. Of course, there were those who abhorred the idea of abortion being legal in Ireland. We have lived under the shadow of extreme Catholicism for the past few hundred years, so everyone expected that. Mostly, it inspired and encouraged women and others to fight and campaign for our basic rights, discuss these themes more openly with our friends, family, etc., and to challenge the cultural hegemony that has existed and unfortunately still exists today that says women should not have a choice over what they do with their bodies. We have to note the key role artists played in the Repeal the Eighth movement, including these series of works created by Sarah and Jessie. I would even go so far as to say it caused an artistic revolution of sorts. Just existing and being a woman in Ireland meant that the Eighth Amendment affected you, so it caused artists all over Ireland to create work that sparked dialogue and told the stories of the women before us. It also inspired the creation of public events to rally support for the movement, including gigs, spoken word nights, and pro-choice exhibitions, many of which I was lucky enough to attend. This movement highlighted art's ability to mobilize and unite. In 2018, a referendum was passed known as the 36th Amendment. Project between artists Jessie Jones and Sarah Browne. Describing their relationship, Sarah says, "We'd known each other's practice closely for many years and felt that at some time we would find the right opportunity to work together. This project, focusing on the regulation of women's bodies by the nation-state, particularly through the instrument of law, was what brought together our shared concerns." The project's inception began in 2015 when they began 1 year of intense research for the project. The key focus was to create a methodology as two artists working together for the first time. They say they follow their instincts, which ended up with them conducting many interviews with activists and campaigners. They made multiple trips to sites of historical significance, including a ferry from Dublin to Liverpool and the Blasket Islands. They visited feminist and women's libraries, including the Royal College of Gynecology Museum in London. They also began during this time to in-depthly look at the legal system and the role it plays in the oppression of women. They began visiting courts and even sat in on the symphysiotomy trials. Symphysiotomy was a procedure used widely up until the 1960s in Ireland. It was a procedure abandoned in most countries in the West but continued to be used in Ireland because of the Catholic nature of our society up until those years. It caused lifelong debilitating effects for the women involved in these court cases who had not consented to this procedure in the first place. The women described the treatment as degrading and inhumane. These cases were about the modern Irish state's obligation to victims of past human rights abuses. This shadowing of legal procedures and exposure to the legal system and its treatment of female victims proved extremely important and relevant in Sarah and Jesse's research. They also began participating in the Northern/Irish Feminist Project, which is a collective of legal academics and practitioners who have wrote essays and worked on many different significant Irish and Northern Irish legal cases. They explore what different outcomes could have been produced if feminist legal reasoning had been used in leading Irish and Northern Irish case law. They also look at how feminist legal theory could contribute to a rethinking of gendered judicial techniques and legal concepts in Ireland. After this 1 year of research, they assembled a group of collaborators for their project. The list is as follows and is available to view on Sarah Browne's website. Legal academic Mairead Enright, midwife and litigant Philomena Canning, who unfortunately has passed away since the creation of this project, composer Alma Kelleher, material culture historian Lisa Godson, photographer Miriam O'Connor, and curator and producer Sarah Griavu. They used a team of all-women producers, technicians, performers, and mediators, which Jessie and Sarah called Femtech. They planned 4 public events and at each site worked with women situated locally who had many different areas of expertise, including Suzanne Dempsey and the News from Nowhere bookshop in Liverpool. In the Shadow of the State comprised of 3 separate events, one of which was repeated in locations in both London and Ireland. The events were titled The Touch and Contract, The Truncheon and the Speculum, and Of Milk and Marble. The community of interest for the project was created through events such as screenings and academic presentations. The first public event was titled Of Milk and Marble and took place in Derry in February of 2016. It took place in a home of particular historical significance, a home that was frequently raided during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, which was permitted by the Special Powers Act in 1922. This event took an artist-led approach. Audience members attended the performance by calling a phone number which gave them directions to a house in Derry. On the day of the performance, the audience were greeted by a woman in the house who took their names. A radio played in the background. It played recent news reports, including details about the symphysiotomy trials that were taking place during this time, the debate of abortion in Northern Ireland. It also told of details about the forced sterilization of women in American prisons, and even included some 1980s pop songs, which I think may have been done to give a waiting room type feel to the audience. After waiting for all of the audience to arrive, they were led to another location, the house I mentioned earlier. They were led into the kitchen where the performer sat at the head of the table. There was a maximum of 10 people at each performance. The performance involved sound, touch, voice and movement and was performed by Louise Matthews. In regards to documenting the events, Jessie and Sarah felt they didn't want moving image to be the outcome of their work, which was the medium both artists primarily used. To remedy this concern, they commissioned Miriam O'Connor to be photographer in residence for the events relating to the project. Miriam travelled with them from the beginning of the project during its research phase. Miriam has created a photographic record that does not attempt to document in an objective manner, but rather tries to use an alternative power, a gaze from the body. Their main aim was to find a sensitive, appropriate, and critical means to document the project. There is very few images of this performance available online, although an in-depth description of the event can be viewed on Sarah Browne's website, Create's website, and also on the Arts Council website. The second event that took place as part of In the Shadow of the State was titled The Truncheon and the Speculum, and took place at the News from Nowhere, a radical community bookshop in Liverpool. It was a live telefeminist broadcast as described on the Arts Council website and took place as part of the Liverpool Biennial. A recorded version of the event can be found on YouTube. It was available to stream online and was also screened in colleges, universities and studios, in Dublin, Northern Ireland, London, Derry, and New York. In their introduction to the event, Sarah and Jesse described it as not a passive viewing experience and encouraged viewers to send comments, questions, and any feedback to them via social media channels Twitter, Facebook, and Google+, using the hashtag #PPArchives. This broadcast explored historic state violence enacted through gynecological means. The title of the broadcast takes inspiration from the Contagious Diseases Act of 1860, which made the forced genital inspection of any woman legal near certain seaport towns in the UK and Ireland. This law allowed any woman to be apprehended by a specialised police officer to be inspected for venereal disease with a speculum. Refusal resulted in imprisonment. Women were seen as carriers of disease and a threat to public health. The aim of this law was to protect the virality of the British Empire and protect its soldiers from diseases such as gonorrhea and syphilis, which 1/3 of British soldiers were infected with during this time period. It was a key moment of state violence against women which still affects attitudes today. Dr. Lisa Godson, material culture historian, a guest on the screening, in-depthly explored the history of the speculum from its invention in Alabama in the 1800s by racial vivisectionist Marion Sims, who performed surgeries and experiments for years on African slaves, and later moved to New York and continued his experiments on Irish women, to its use in Pompeii and even in Paris, where it was first used to inspect prostitutes for disease. She also discusses in more detail the Contagious Diseases Act, which I previously mentioned. She then goes on to talk of modern-day mistreatment of women in regards to forced gynecological examinations, with some taking place as late as 2010 and 2012, highlighting that these issues are still of pertinence today. The second guest on the screening was Cloud Kinky, self-identified cyborg witch of Catalan collective Gynapunk. After a particularly awful experience with a gynecologist in her home place of Spain, she was inspired to explore ways of performing examinations on herself and to learn more about her own body and how it worked. She shows how to use a speculum, a scissors, and apple cider vinegar, which can be bought in any shop, to perform an exam on the cervix and test for possibly mutated tissue. This means that you could then go on to get further tests by a doctor. It is used as a method often in countries where people may not have constant access to doctors or gynecologists. She also held a workshop in the same space, the Radical Bookshop in Liverpool, with members of the public on how to perform these exams. Her aim is to change the body into a space of understanding, knowledge, and autonomy. The final event, the Touching Contract, took place in December 2016. It comprised of 2 runnings of the one performance, one in London and one in Ireland, and legal workshops in collaboration with legal academic Moraid Enright. The identity of the participants remained anonymous unless they chose to reveal it. The events were not recorded or photographed. Instead, they were documented by 2 courtroom artists, Alwyn Gillespie and Priscilla Coleman. In London, the public performances of the Touching Contract took place in a courtroom in Toynbee Studios, and in Ireland it took place in the Pillar Room of the Rotunda Maternity Hospital. Before viewing the performance, individuals were asked to sign a legal contract consenting to the performance, where they would be physically touched in a number of ways by performers. They were also able to view an archive of research of real legal documents that were used as research for the creation of the document that they themselves were signing. Legal mediators were present and answered any questions the participants had. As I mentioned earlier, there was no photo or video documentation of the performance or its participants, but there is a documentation of one of the dress rehearsals which can be viewed on YouTube. There is a wealth of critical engagement with this project, including articles written in The Guardian, the Visual Artists Ireland newsletter, and the Irish Times. There was also multiple lectures given in different universities looking at the project given by Tina Kinsella and Moraid Enright. Sarah and Jesse engaged and created this project, with collaboration playing a key and important role. By working with lawyers, legal academics, historians, midwives, and activists, Jesse and Sarah created a wealth of knowledge to build the project on, with their collaborators contributing to all aspects of the projects. Their performances took an artist-led approach with the careful consideration of the aesthetics of the place where the performance took place, and the performance itself, using symbolism to make the viewer question their own bodily autonomy and look at the role of state and legal system in this autonomy. By adding the live broadcast element to their project, they created a powerful space for discussion and dialogue between themselves and members of the public, encouraging people to ask as many questions as they liked and add comments and feedback about the project.